second day of the Tudor Travel Guide's Field of Cloth of Gold 500 Virtual Summit. I hope you enjoyed day one and are looking forward to the second day's speakers. I am delighted to say that on the beginning of this second day, we have a speaker from across the channel. And it only seemed right to me when I was putting together this event that as the original field was actually a bipartisan event involving the cooperation of two nations who were, let's face it, more often than not at loggerheads with one another, so we should have representation in our summit of the French court and the French perspective on the event from one of our friends in France. And so it is a great pleasure, or it was a great pleasure, to be able to interview Professor Charles Giry-Deloison over video link and to quiz him about the field of cloth of gold. But in contrast to our first speaker, focusing in on how the field panned out from the view of Francis I and his court. Now, Charles is Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Artois in Arras, France, which is not far from the original site of the field, so very apt indeed. And his area of expertise is late 15th, early 17th century English history, particularly focusing on English diplomacy and England's relationship with France and the continent. Amongst many publications, Charles is the author of 1520, Le Champ du Drap D'Or, which in English is also translated as 1520, The Field of Cloth of Gold, of course. And in fact, that book is written both in French and English, if you would like to purchase a copy. He's also written numerous articles and chapters on Anglo-French relations and is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and of the Société de l'Histoire de France. So, without further ado, as before, let's go straight over and you'll find me in conversation with Charles. So, Charles, welcome and thank you for joining our virtual summit to celebrate the 500th anniversary of the Field of Cloth of Gold.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation.
And you're speaking to us today from France, I understand.
Absolutely, from Arras, so not very far from the Field of Cloth of Gold itself.
Well, that's very poignant, isn't it? And I really look forward to hearing about the Field of Cloth of Gold from the French perspective, which is what you're going to be telling us about principally today. So without further ado, let's just dive in, and perhaps we can start at the beginning with an idea of this name, the Field of Cloth of Gold. Why was it called that? Where did it come from?
Well, it comes from, it was set up in a place just outside, in the Pale, in English Pale of Calais, just between Guines and Arles, which was called the Val d'Oré. But actually the name of Field of Cloth of Gold comes from the contemporary name, the Field of Cloth of Gold, because of the extraordinary display of gold tents and gold dresses, etc., etc. And that's where the name actually comes from.
Okay, and I mean, I'm right in saying, aren't I, that the Field of Cloth of Gold was almost famous in its own lifetime, which is quite unusual for historic events.
It was, it was extremely famous, yes.
But what made it so unique at the time? Why was there so much attention?
Well, I think it was unique because for several reasons. One, it was the first time that two French king with a French and an English king met. The last time was in 1475, and it's actually very rare that monarchs met in any case. And in some ways, the Field of Cloth of Gold started a trend which would last mostly throughout the 16th century. One must remember there's only one other meeting between Henry and Francis in 1532, and after 1532 there's absolutely no meeting between a French king or queen and an English king or queen. So it really is an event in that respect. But it's also because it struck the imaginations of the population, the sheer lavishness of it, the sheer display of, there's the Feast of Arms, there's about 20,000 people there. It's actually amazing. There's a visit, you could visit Henry VIII's palace when it was being constructed. You could go and see what was going on. So it was a huge event, absolutely huge event. Sort of comparable to Olympic Games, if you like, today. Quite amazing.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, no political significance practically, which is quite fascinating.
I can just imagine it being seen by the local population as such a spectacle, and people going, we've got to go and see this.
Yes, you do it. And if you look at this, there's this very famous painting at Hampton Court, which dates at the 1540s, of the Field of Cloth of Gold, which is a composite painting. And you can see two little drunken chaps fighting underneath the fountain, which displayed the wine, white and red wine. So yes, they had great fun. And they spent a lot of money.
Yes, not to mention the money, that's for sure. Maybe we'll touch on that a little bit later on. But why did the Field of Cloth of Gold come about in the first place?
I think that there are two main reasons. The first one is you're still in a time where the idea that problems between two monarchies can be better solved by the monarchs themselves rather than ambassadors, envoys or whatever else. There's still that feeling that speaking face to face is actually the way to deal, mainly because monarchs belong to one family, which is different from the rest of the population. The other thing is it was always set out to be not a political meeting, but a feast. And therefore you've got two very young monarchs. Henry's 29 in 1520, Francis is 25 or 26 in 1520. They're very young people and they're going there to have fun. And the other thing is probably there is the feeling that monarchs meeting will be able to install this new area of peace that one is expecting in the Christendom.
Mm. And but there was a lot going on in Europe at the time, wasn't there? The context of the Field of Cloth of Gold was quite interesting, and I presume was interwoven with why the two monarchs, Henry and Francis, actually did get to meet. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about that context and some of the important aspects of it.
Yes, there's several aspects to the context. There is first a relative idea that peace it is time for peace, and that's going on since 1514. There are a series of treaties between the main kingdoms in Europe. There are two treaties between France and England in 1514 and 1518. 1514 one is the start, actually, the Field of Cloth of Gold. There's a treaty between Francis and Charles of Spain, still not yet Charles V, or the Emperor, in Noyon in 1516. There's a treaty in 1517 at Cambrai, not far from here, between Francis, the Emperor Maximilian, and Charles. And so that is a context where the idea is that one should be able to find an agreement between the four main contenders in Europe. The other context which actually goes with it is that the humanist movement has pushed towards peace, and Erasmus has been the main contender in this. He wrote in 1517, was published in 1517, that the Lament of Peace, where he calls the different monarchs to come together and to listen to the word of God and to bring peace to Europe. So there is that movement towards peace, undoubtedly. And there's also some very political things, like the threat from the Turks in the southern part of Europe. The Turks had taken Constantinople in 1453. They've moved into Syria in 1516. They're moving into Egypt in 1517. There is a threat there. And there is also the fact that the Pope, regarding this threat, has called for many years for a crusade to be uptaken against the Turks. He called already in 1516, 1517, not great response from the different monarchs, but again in 1518. So there is this idea that one must unite against the Turks. And I said also the Italian question. Italy is divided up into little principalities, and there is a great competition between the Spaniards and between the Spaniards and France to hold these different principalities. And undoubtedly, France's victory in Marignan in 1515 was a turning point in that respect. And closer to 1520, of course, what did bring a huge change was the death of the Emperor Maximilian in January 1519, which led to election to the empire in May-June 1519, which obviously Charles of Spain won against Francis I and against Henry, who sort of tried to pretend he would like to become emperor, but nothing very serious. But Francis put a lot of money to bribes and promises of help, etc., to the electors, the 7 electors in the Diet in Worms. Anyhow, Francis lost, Charles won, and that of course changed the situation a lot in Europe, because instead of having 4 main contenders, France, Spain and Netherlands, the Empire and England, there are only 3. France, the Roman Empire, grabbing Netherlands and Spain obviously together, Charles the Emperor, and England. And so in that context, the role of England was sort of be able to keep a balance between France and the Empire. So yes, there is a lot of things going on in the few years before 1520. There's this push towards peace, which is, I think, something people believe in, and there's always the very political threat from the Turks, the necessity of defending Europe against this threat.
Now, you mentioned actually that kind of the very first mootings of this meeting was way back in 1514.
Yes.
But obviously it took some 6 years to come about. Some careful diplomatic negotiations, no doubt, required, and a lot of jockeying for prestige and etc. from these 2 alpha male monarchs. But why did it take so long, and kind of what finally brought it together, and who were the key players in that?
Well, it took a long time, and you're quite right. 6 years is a very long time, even in those days. 6 years is a long time. It took a long time because the first idea was mooted in the summer of 1514, but you were then talking about a different context, in as much that the King of France was Louis XII. He was an aging man. He married Mary, Henry's sister, in August 1514, and we all know that a bit too much activity in bed meant that Louis died in the 1st of January 1515. And so obviously immediately the context changed. We've got a new monarch in France. How is Francis going to behave towards England? What is his attitude going to be? How is Henry going to get on or not get on with Francis? So that's one of the major changes. The second is, and actually goes with it, is that France's preoccupation was not England. France's preoccupation was to go to Italy and claim back what Louis XII had lost. And the fact that in September 1515, that's 8 months after he became king, he won this extremely prestigious victory at Marignan, changed the balance of power between, or the game between France and England. And then you've got you've got the Italian context, and then you've got Charles V, or the future Charles V, Charles of Spain, who comes to the throne in 1516, and there again is going to be a new player in the game. So all this added up means to say that the sort of stabilization of the situation takes a very long time, and it's not before really 1518 that things get done. And yes, okay, we've got to try and find a way to get together. There was this plan when Henry VIII and Louis XII were talking. So what can we do now? And I'm pretty certain that Thomas Wolsey played a great role in getting them together. And actually, if you think of it, Francis signed a document saying, okay, we hand over, the French hand over to the English, and we hand over to Thomas Wolsey the organisation of the Field of Cloth of Gold. So it may be in a way also of saying, okay, if it doesn't work, it's all the English fault and not the French fault, but is also recognising the role of Thomas in this situation.
So we have another speaker specifically talking about Henry and his men,
yeah.
and Wolsey. So we'll save our chat about Wolsey's role in bringing this together until a little bit later in the summit. But one of the things that's always intrigued me, and you mentioned, of course, Charles V, the new Holy Roman Emperor, a major player in Europe. I'm always intrigued as to why he didn't muscle in on the event, and why just Francis and Henry, and what was going on there?
Well, it is a bilateral summit, and it started in 1518 as to be a bilateral summit. That was the idea. There was never question of having anybody else in it. In any case, in 1518, Charles was not emperor. It was Maximilian, and it was a completely different context. The second thing is that when Charles was elected emperor in June 1519, he was elected against, though he had unanimously elected, nevertheless it was against Francis I. And Francis, for a long time, right up to end of April or early May, thought that he had great chance of winning the empire. And though he did say after having lost that he didn't really much care about it, that the burden of the empire would be far too much in any case and cost far too much money, which in effect he was quite right. But nevertheless, there was some resentment between Francis and Charles. So bringing in Charles at a summit which is supposed to be a pleasant meeting would have been a very, very bad idea. And a very bad idea from the French point of view. And I think from Charles's point of view, Charles was afraid of a meeting between, a rapprochement between England and France. He was fearing that.
And we see that, don't we, I think, in the fact that Charles managed to squeeze in a visit to England.
Yes.
He was obviously trying to get on Henry's good side just in advance of the Field of Cloth of Gold. What can you tell us about that visit, and what was that Charles's intention?
Yes, it was his intention. It's very interesting the fact that in 1519 Charles had been in Spain since 1517. He arrived in Spain for the first time in early 1517. He did not know Spain at all, and he was brought up in the Netherlands. And so he arrives in 1517. He arrives in a difficult country. There's 2 kingdoms there. He's got to deal with that. And when he's elected emperor in 1519, he's obviously got to go and be crowned emperor, and that happens in Aix-la-Chapelle in Aachen. And to go there are 2 routes. You go by land, you go through obviously Spain, and then you go up through Italy and Germany. Spain, Germany, he's on his own territory, but to go through Italy, he's got to go through French possessions of Milan and Genoa, and he's got to ask Francis permission. Quite likely Francis would have given his permission, like he did in 1514 when Charles came through France in 1540. So that wouldn't have been a problem. The other route was to go by sea and go past England and land in the Netherlands. And some of Charles's advisors said take the land route, the others said take the sea route. And the land route was a way of also answering the Cortes, the main sort of political organisation in Spain. Anyhow, Charles chose the sea route because he wanted to speak to Henry before Henry met Francis. And the problem, we are there in May 1519, he goes up to La Corona, the winds are contrary, he cannot leave, he spends 6 weeks waiting for the winds going to be right direction. Suddenly the winds change, huge gust of wind, and he gets from Corona to Dover in 7 days, which is extraordinarily quick when you consider it. And that allows him to meet Henry, who's in Dover already, ready to embark and to cross. So it was a very, very short, to use an expression of today, window of opportunity there he had.
He
was extremely short. He was very lucky, very lucky. And Francis knew about this, obviously. He actually knew that that's what was going on. So it did not come to a surprise to the French at all, at all. And it's in Dover that they met. Henry behaves towards Charles like he was going to, like he did after towards Francis. He rushes into his bedroom in the morning, jumps on his bed, and sort of embraces him. Exactly what he'll do at the Field of Cloth of Gold with Francis. And they agree that they would meet 10 days after the Field of Cloth of Gold between Dunkerque and Gravelines, which they did.
Right. Okay. So we've got a lot on the context there, which is great. So what about the Field of Cloth of Gold itself? You mentioned a little bit about where it took place, but can you describe a little bit more about where was the Field of Cloth of Gold, and why did it happen there?
Well, the problem is, unfortunately, we've got absolutely no trace of the precise location of the Field of Cloth of Gold, nor do we know the precise location of Henry's palace. We just do not know where they were. We know that it was between Didnt and Ardres. It is in English territory, it's on the Pale of Calais. It was chosen there because it was on the border with France, and also because the geographical situation was the easiest to accommodate so many people. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people to come. We're talking about hundreds of tents that you've got to put up. We're talking about a tilt yard. So we're talking about a lot of, you need space. You need space. As far as we know, the area was sort of flattened out to make things easier. But we cannot precisely locate where exactly it happens. And so when you come to the north of France and they put you the route of the Field of Cloth of Gold, certainly, but we're not quite sure where it was.
In this general area.
Absolutely.
I've been myself. It is quite a flat. The so-called field itself is quite flat.
If it is precisely there, you see, that's the whole question.
That's what we don't really know. Well, I gazed across there and let my imagination go on. But maybe, can I just sidestep for a moment? Because this term, the Pale of Calais, is used quite a lot. And maybe some people don't really know exactly what that means. So could you just describe what it was and the significance of it?
Yes, the Pale is the word to qualify the territory which belongs to the English in France around Calais. Like you have the English Pale in Ireland was the territory occupied by the English in Ireland. So it's only that. It's just a territory occupied by the English, and they call it the Pale.
And it was a kind of a hangover from the earlier medieval period, wasn't it?
It's the remains of the 100 Years' War, absolutely. The only English territory on the continent, which they'll lose in 1558.
Okay. Yes. So now I was really curious. I read your book about the Field of Cloth of Gold, and I was really interested in the bit that you talked about how the French saw the English and kind of the slang terms for the English at the time. So I was quite interested to know more about how the common folk who lived around the Pale of Calais saw this event and saw all these English people pitching up, on close to where they lived.
Well, it's difficult to say because we've got absolutely no trace of that, no information about that. What we do have are our little booklets, the very poor quality booklets, which were published and printed during the Field of Cloth of Gold or just afterwards. There's also one actually for the meeting between Henry and Charles afterwards, which were sold at very low price. Obviously people bought them, and obviously people read them, and those who couldn't read, they were read to them. So there was interest in the population. You mustn't forget that the Pale was English, populated by English people, or French and English people. So the English presence in the Pale was something that the French were used to. It's also an area very close to the Netherlands. So you've got another foreign country very close. So people in that area are used to living with foreigners around them. That's no surprise there at all. What they thought of the French, I think, is still is exactly what they thought of them in 15 1512, 1513, when Henry invaded France and the north of France in 1513, and you got a few poems extremely rude about the English, and it's the sort of resentment coming back up that was felt during the 100 Years' War, and which you'll find after that later on in the 16th century. So yes, there is a very anti-English sentiment. But interestingly enough, there's probably also a sentiment, some sort of superiority of the French over the English. And that you can note when Mary Tudor came over to marry Louis XII in 1514. And she was greeted on the coast in Abbeville. She got married in Abbeville and greeted in Boulogne. And the first remark that the French make is how badly she's dressed. She's less dressed like an English woman, and she's sent to change, and she comes back dressed like a French or an Italian woman, actually, and that was far better, far better. So yes, you do have this ambivalent attitude towards the English, and don't forget also is that the French and English sailors are always bickering about fishing rights in the Channel. It hasn't quite changed actually a lot since then, but anyhow, you do have that as well. So yes, there is that attitude towards rather ambivalent towards the English.
Nevertheless, hopefully when the wine started to flow, people got into the past.
Yes, I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did.
So there were lots of preparations, of course. Staging the Field of Cloth of Gold was just a monumental undertaking on both sides. Can you tell us a bit about the French preparations and the build-up to the actual event taking place?
Yes, well, we're extremely fortunate in France that we've kept a manuscript which describes all the different elements which were needed, from the tents to the wood to etc, 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 the food, of everything which was needed for the Field of Cloth of Gold. And we know who took part in organising all that. We know we've got quite a number of names of the workmen who did the work. And yes, it's a huge, absolutely huge enterprise. You get wood floated down from the Netherlands, you get cloths made in Tours, the Loire Valley brought up as well. So one should imagine thousands of people working on the Field of Cloth of Gold between March 1520 and very last second in early June 1520. So it's an extraordinary enterprise, absolutely extraordinary enterprise. And you've got, of course, Henry floating his palace over from Dover to Calais, which is another extraordinary thing to do. You've really got to imagine how difficult it must have been to be able to build this extraordinary event in so few weeks, finally.
So short a period of time, it's absolutely mind-blowing.
It is, yes, it is. And then they took it all down, and Henry's palace went back to England. The French used some of the planks of wood they needed. They used them to as fortifications afterwards, which Thomas Wolsey complained bitterly about. And some of the French tents were used for in another war later on. So there was lot of stuff was reused afterwards. In any case.
Yes, I can imagine. Lots of recycling. They were very good at recycling in those.
Well, I can imagine the cost that they got to do something with it.
Absolutely, and in fact, speaking of cost, do we have any idea, particularly from the French perspective, what the cost was?
We do not have an exact figure, obviously, of how much the cost was. It was extremely high. It was extremely high. We know that a lot of the French nobility spent a huge sums buying all these cloths of gold because it's obviously extremely expensive, and you know that in those days the king only allowed you to use cloth of gold in very specific circumstances, so yes, a lot of them had to borrow money to actually go to the Field of Cloth of Gold and to look as good as possible at the Field of Cloth of Gold. So yes, you're talking about huge amounts of money, absolutely huge. I mean, you've been millions of pounds today to do sort of a comparison.
Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic.
Incredible. And the Field of Cloth of Gold got underway on the 7th of June, is that right?
Yes.
And it was. Can you just describe the meeting of the two monarchs and kind of how the event got underway?
Well, they met on the first day very quickly. The idea was to get rid of anything political that needed to be just sorted out, and so they signed again the same treaty as 1518. And after that, it was time to have fun. And so the idea was you had the tilts, you had the tilt yard, you had a lot of dancing, you had a lot of eating, you had a lot of drinking, and every day you'd be in the French side of the camp or in the English side. You go from one to the other. The French would go to the English, or the English would come to the French, in disguise or not disguised. I mean, there are a huge amount of entertainments were going on then.
And it's called the overall event, I suppose, out with the partying was a feat of arms.
Yes.
And again, can you describe exactly what that means and what that would have entailed?
Yes. Well, again, one should go back to that very good composite painting of 1540 about the Field of Cloth of Gold, because you can see actually the tilt yard there. You can also see the ovens, you can see the way they prepared food, etc., etc. You can see the tents. The Feast of Arms was this, based on the chivalric idea that a tournament is main point of is actually, to put it in other words, it is playing at war, and you've got to realise that for monarchs and for nobility in 15th or 16th century, that their main activity is to go to war. And peace is just the interlude between two wars. And so when you're at peace, you're preparing for the next war. You're playing for the next war. You're rehearsing. Anyhow, and so at the Field of Cloth of Gold, you will have foot combats. You'll have tournaments which involve several people together, and you'll also have two knights at arms fighting on each side on horseback, and fighting on it, as we know, with the lance, and fighting on each side of a barrier. So you have all that, which is a feast of arms. It's just not two people on horseback fighting. It's also foot combat, and it's also tournaments which involve more people. And you have the Tree of Honour, where people put up their shields and say, "I'm going to combat such and such a person." And to be very politically correct and to avoid any problem, Henry and Francis never fought face to face. They've always fought side by side, just to make sure that nothing bad would happen.
Except the wrestling match, I think.
Well, yes. I'm not quite sure if it actually did happen, because we've only got. Well, there's only one. Mention of it, and it's only a French person who mentioned it a bit later on. So did it really happen? I'm not quite sure. I'm amazed that if it did happen, why wasn't it more mentioned? Why is there only one document mentioning it? Why nothing on the English side? That might be understandable, but nothing on the French side, particularly as Francis does in what they call a tour de Bretagne, that throws him on the floor. I'm not quite sure. Not quite sure. There's always has been, for me at least, a little doubt about that. And if it did happen, actually, it had strictly no effect on the field, on the good outcome of the Field of Cloth of Gold, because Henry never said anything about it and never sort of went off in a huff or anything. So it was.
And now you mention it, it does seem strange that they went to such lengths to fight side by side in the tilt, to avoid any such kind of controversy.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it might have happened, but there's always, for me, a little doubt about it.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So, from a French point of view, how many people took part in the whole event?
We're talking around 10,000 people, probably. There's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah, and I suspect, all of the royal family and the Meiji nobility would have been in attendance.
Well, certainly the royal family, and one of the reasons it had to happen in June 1520 even though Charles V had tried to say, can we have it later, etc., can you have it later, so I can see Henry at peace, was because Francis' wife, Claude de France, was pregnant, and she actually had a child, Mathilde, in that a few weeks later, and so they had to have it then, so the queens could be present. And the queens, of course, would preside over the tilts and the Feast of Arms.
Mm. Mm. So the whole event lasted for, what was it, some 10 days? Or so?
2 weeks, yes, 14 days, yes. Yeah. So it's a long time.
A long time, and I always feel quite sad that the whole thing was blighted by such bad weather.
Yes.
That was a bit of a disaster, particularly, I remember from the French point of view, the tents were blown away. It must have been horrendous after all the effort that went into it.
Yes, it was rather unfortunate, but it also happened a fortnight later when Henry met Charles. Henry had built a very specific pavilion which was actually the sort of basis of what an Elizabethan theatre looked like, and that was blown away as well because of very huge winds. So even in June or early July, you could not expect good weather. So yes, the tents were blown away, and anyhow.
Yes, but overall, what would you say about the how the aims of the meeting were met? Was there the outcome that the two monarchs were looking for?
I think one can say that it was a great success at the time when it was happening, and a few days after. It was a great success, and I think that's why it struck people by the extraordinary event it was, and I think that in that respect it was a success. Politically, of course, it's completely different. It's completely different. Because you've got Henry and Charles meeting 10 days later. Francis knew about that. Francis did send an envoy to be part of the meeting, so he was not totally excluded. He did not take it badly, but the problem was that again, it's this idea that you're in days where war was the main occupation of monarchs, and peace could not last. Peace could not last, and actually, war between Francis and Charles started again in the summer of 1520. So, and the relations between France and England deteriorated very, very quickly as well. So, yes, it was a great popular success. It was a great success as much it was a great feast. They had a great time. It got the English over to France, which they very, very much enjoyed because they hadn't been over to France since 1518 for some of them. So they're rediscovering the north of France in a very nice atmosphere. But politically, it didn't bring much. It did not bring much, except I think it did mark the sort of popular memory and the memory of everybody. Actually, that's not a popular memory. The memory of everybody. Everybody remembered that the Field of Calais happened, and it became a sort of reference afterwards of how two kings can meet and can get on for at least for a fortnight.
And do you think that's the legacy of the event, or is there any other aspect that we should remember today as we approach the 500th anniversary?
Well, I think it was interesting to see that in the mid-19th century, early 20th century, when there was a great revival of the Field of Cloth of Gold. There were plays about the Field of Cloth of Gold, pantomimes, etc., etc. So there was there has been a long-lasting memory of this event. Can it say anything of political relations between France and England? No, quite honestly, I don't think so. If it had, we'd have had more meetings between French and English monarchs. And I say after 1532, the next one was in 1852, if my memory is good. So it's a long time.
A long time. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and your knowledge about Field of Cloth of Gold. It's been lovely to talk to you today. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you very much.